Have you ever wondered what the deal was with all the fantasy movies in the 1980s? And I don't even mean the broader definition of fantasy, including flicks such as Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Big Trouble in Little China. I'm talking sword and sorcery, elves and orcs and epic quests. A simple glance at Wikipedia's list of sword and sorcery films reveals a conspicuous disparity in the number of 1980s releases compared to, well, any other decade. Why this is, I'm not 100% sure, but I have a theory. See, while J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit had been around for more than 40 years by the advent of the 80s, a surge of interest in high fantasy had arrived thanks in part to the hugely successful paperback editions of The Hobbit's sequel trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. The seminal adventure stories gained a powerful foothold on college campuses, and I myself was lucky enough to receive my father's original box set that, in his words, caused him to miss a lot of classes, choosing instead to continue his journey with Frodo Baggins and company. In my view, 1977 was perhaps the most pivotal single year in influencing the 80s fantasy boom. Helping to set the stage was the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, which had first appeared in 1974 and quickly gained a following, leading the way for the 1977 release of the game's immensely popular second edition, also known as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But perhaps more important than this was the arrival of the long-awaited follow-up to The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, that very same year. Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara series also kicked off in 1977 to instant success. And finally, we cannot underestimate the overwhelming cultural impact of Star Wars. While not strictly sword and sorcery due primarily to its setting, the hallmarks of the subgenre tapped into a cultural demand for otherworldly adventure stories, with swashbuckling heroes, larger-than-life villains, mystical sages, damsels in distress, and the unambiguous triumph of good over evil. Even within the hyper-specific category of sword and sorcery, the 1980s boasted films of all stripes. Of course, you have the bigger budget epics like Willow and Conan the Barbarian, and then there's the artsy romantic stuff such as Legend and Lady Hawk. Animation had its fair share of genre entries with flicks like Fire and Ice and The Flight of Dragons, and let's not forget the Italian Conan knockoffs either, movies like Conquest and ATOR, the Fighting Eagle. But perhaps the most well-remembered fantasy films of the time were the family features, movies like The Princess Bride and The Neverending Story. So today we're going to talk about a filmmaker who threw his hat into the proverbial ring of fantasy not once, but twice throughout the decade. His first foray, a project with an all-puppet ensemble, followed by our main topic of discussion, a sinuous cult classic to be with a little more glam. Let's get lost, shall we? By the 1980s, Jim Henson was a name known by most, having effectively cornered the market in puppetry. Muppetry. Starting his career while still in high school, the Mississippi native's creations graduated from local to national television, appearing in everything from commercials to talk shows before featuring in their very own children's program starting in 1969, a little show called Sesame Street. The success of Sesame Street paved the way for another, more adult-oriented program featuring Henson's creations, The Muppet Show, which began taping in the UK in 1976. Although Henson had become well known in the television space, his interest in feature films was a constant. His 1966 short film Timepiece was even nominated for an Academy Award, but if the master puppeteer was to see his work on the silver screen, his already popular Muppets presented the path of least resistance. And so, in the summer of 1979, the world saw the big screen debut of Henson's Little Fleece family in The Muppet Movie. The film performed remarkably well at the box office, allowing for a 1981 sequel, The Great Muppet Caper, for which Henson himself would step into the director's chair. The puppeteer-cum-filmmaker owed his career to Kermit the Frog and friends, but his desire to work outside the world of Muppets was a driving force in his mind. Taking inspiration from a book of illustrated poems by Lewis Carroll and building upon the visual style of his recurring Saturday Night Live segment The Land of Gorch, Henson began working on a project he called The Crystal, a dark fantasy story that harkened back to the heavy themes of the original Grimm's fairy tales. Henson wrote a 25-page treatment that was as enchanting as it was frightening, believing that it was healthy for children to experience fear. With Gary Kurtz of Star Wars fame as his producing partner, Henson tapped Brian Froud as concept artist after seeing his work in a book of fantasy illustrations. Scripting duties ultimately fell to a writer named David Odell, who drew heavily from Jane Roberts' Seth material, a collection of writings claimed to have been dictated from an incorporeal entity named Seth. The work is widely regarded as a cornerstone of New Age philosophy. Anyway, sharing his director's chair with longtime collaborator Frank Oz, the famed performer for Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, and of course Yoda, Henson shot what would now be known as The Dark Crystal over 6 months in 1981. The film did well enough at the box office to turn a profit, but critical reception was mixed at the time. Henson thus returned to the world of children's programming over the next several years, overseeing a new Muppet movie, the first Sesame Street theatrical feature, a few television specials, and a new show called Fraggle Rock. But Henson wasn't quite done with the realm of fairy tales and magic. Realizing that the Dark Crystal had perhaps gotten a bit, well, darker than intended, the filmmaker spoke with Froud about a lighter fantasy story with more humor and maybe a few human characters with which the puppets could interact.
I had this strong image of the baby surrounded by goblins. His eyes lit up. He said, "That sounds great, goblins." And he said, "Well, what's the story?" And I said, "A labyrinth is often symbolic of many things. So if we had a labyrinth in it, it could mean all sorts of things."
As much as he loved Dark Crystal, I think he needed a bit of the absurd back. And Labyrinth was an opportunity to get a little absurd again and to get funny.
In the year following the Dark Crystal's lukewarm success, Henson and Froud met with author Dennis Lee, well known at the time for his book of children's poetry, Alligator Pie. They hired the scribe to write a short novella outlining the story upon which the screenplay could be based. As for the screenwriting itself, Henson's daughter suggested Monty Python member Terry Jones, having just read his novel, Eric the Viking. However, Jones disliked the source material he was given, thereby tossing out Lee's novella and writing his own story to the numerous drawings that Froud was busy producing.
I sat at my desk with Brian's drawings stacked on one side of the desk and writing away sort of to see what would happen. And every time I came to a new scene and I needed something to happen, I looked through Brian's drawings and found a character who was kind of speaking to me already. And suddenly there was the scene. It was wonderful. It was a strange way of collaborating, because although Brian and I never sat down and worked together, it felt that that's what we were doing the whole time.
The plot would ultimately follow an adolescent girl who must make her way through a perilous maze to rescue her baby brother, whom she has inadvertently wished into the clutches of Jareth, the Goblin King. The script went through numerous revisions, with multiple writers, including George Lucas, injecting their own sensibilities into the story. But perhaps the most affecting element in the script's development would not come from the writing department, but rather casting.
When we first started to write this film, we had this evil Goblin King. And then somewhere quite early on, we said, what if he were a rock singer, a contemporary figure? And then we said, who? And we said, Michael Jackson, Sting, David Bowie. See, I mean, there are only a few people you would think of. And David was immediately the one we wanted.
He first brought me the concept on the 1983 tour that I did in America, and asked me if I'd consider doing the part. And he showed me Brian Froud's artwork, and he showed me a copy of The Dark Crystal, which I found a fascinating piece of work. And I could see the potentiality of making that kind of movie with humans, with songs, with a more of a lighter comedy script.
Once it was decided that Bowie would take up the mantle of Jareth, the project naturally evolved into a sort of musical, with tunes written and performed by Bowie himself. Bowie's public persona, as well as rumors about his private life, also highlighted an emergent theme in the story, that of the transition from childhood into adulthood.
I wanted to put two characters of flesh and bone in the middle of all these artificial creatures, and David Bowie embodies a certain maturity with his sexuality, his disturbing aspect, all sorts of things that characterize the adult world.
Casting the young leading lady would take place between England and the United States, seeing such teen actors as Helena Bonham Carter, Laura Dern, Sarah Jessica Parker, Marissa Tomei, Mia Sara, and Ali Sheedy try their hand at the role of Sarah. But one relatively inexperienced hopeful stood out among the rest.
When you're casting a part like Sarah, which is the part in the film, you hope someone walks in the door and is the right person. And when Jenny walked in, she was the right person. And it was one of those great little moments. She did a wonderful reading, and she's a bright, intelligent actress who takes direction well, and everything was just right.
It hasn't been one of my aspirations to be an actress. I sort of wanted to be a vet, or I wanted to be a carpenter or something. I didn't know what I wanted to be, but I never thought of being in films. So I just really started with modeling because friends of my parents asked me if I wanted to. Then I started doing commercials. Then I went on a film audition, which was for Once Upon a Time in America. I think it was my first one, actually. I don't know, it just sort of happened.
With the leads cast and shooting script locked, production was ready to begin. Like The Dark Crystal, principal photography took several months to complete, wrapping in September of 1985. The variety of set pieces made for a particularly complicated shoot, but showcased a more diverse array of Froud's design talents than his prior effort with Henson. The promotional lead up to the film's release saw features in publications such as Starlog and even the New York Times. Bowie's involvement also had the music world looking forward to the film, as the rocker had recorded 5 new songs for the soundtrack. Henson and company were hopeful that all their hard work would pay off with a positive critical reception and box office numbers. Unfortunately, things didn't quite shake out that way. On June 27, 1986, Labyrinth hit movie screens across the United States to lukewarm acquiescence. Opening against 2 comedies, the Zucker brothers' Ruthless People and the Billy Crystal buddy cop flick Running Scared didn't seem like a risky move, but the landscape of ongoing theatrical runs was too strong to overcome, including hit films such as The Karate Kid Part 2, Top Gun, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Critical reception was similarly mild, earning praise from some for the film's scale and Henson's creativity. Richard Corliss noted in Time magazine the film's many influences, something the movie wears proudly on its sleeve. Sarah's bedroom contains books such as The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, and Grimm's Fairy Tales, but more notably some works of Maurice Sendak, his book Outside Over There being a story about a girl who must rescue her baby sister who has been stolen by goblins.
I think what we're trying to do with this film is kind of harken back to a lot of those classic fantasy adventures that a young girl goes into. The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, and the works of Maurice Sendak. I don't mind comparisons. It's not like we're trying to outdo them. We're simply related. The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland are so much a part of us. This is the fantasy world that she has grown up with. These are the stories that have fascinated her.
Even some classic Hollywood was drawn upon, including Marlon Brando's leather jacket from The Wild One, and this scene with Cary Grant and Shirley Temple from the 1947 film The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer.
Ready, Poop? Let's scoot.
Wait.
Wait. Hey, you remind me of a man.
What man?
The man with the power.
What power?
The power of hoodoo.
Hoodoo?
You do.
Do what?
Remind me of a man.
What man?
The man with the power.
Good morning.
You remind me of the babe. Babe with the power. Power of voodoo. You do. Remind me of the babe.
The country's foremost critics at the time, Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, both gave Labyrinth negative reviews, the latter stating, quote, "The sight of a baby in peril is one of the sleaziest gimmicks a film can employ to gain our attention, but Henson does it." Personally, I've always been more of a Dark Crystal guy, but one can't help but marvel at the imagination on display in not only Labyrinth, but all of Henson's work. I've never been much of a David Bowie fan, so the songs don't do a lot for me, but his performance is fine. Connelly is likewise serviceable in her role, but I think my assessment of both human performances is tampered by the fact that I just find the puppets far more interesting than the people. It's admittedly a taste thing, and I found this to be true with much of Henson's stuff, as only a handful of actors have managed to play off their puppet counterparts without feeling like they're bringing things down a notch with their participation. By the end of its US run, Labyrinth had barely earned back half of its budget, and not even international revenue could get it into the black. This sent Jim Henson into a deep depression, and Labyrinth would end up being his last theatrical effort before his sudden death in 1990. Of course, Labyrinth's legacy would not fall to its weak initial reception. The movie did very well on home video, earning what could only be described as a cult following. Fortunately, Henson was able to see the growing fan base around both Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal before he passed away at the age of 53. Being a family film in the post-Star Wars world of 1986, Or should I say 9 ABY? Anyway, merchandising opportunities were certainly on the table, but Labyrinth never had a ton of stuff you could buy. While many children of the 80s and 90s fondly remember the LucasArts adventure games like Monkey Island and Sam & Max, perhaps even fewer realize that the developer's first point-and-click adventure title was based on Henson's movie. It's true, and many of the game's design elements went on to influence Maniac Mansion the very next year. But that's not what we're here to talk about. While Labyrinth the computer game was the only video game based on the film released in the United States, the comparative success of the film in Japan versus other territories made way for a regionally exclusive title, and Japanese gamers would be able to play it on their home Nintendo console. This is Labyrinth, Maou no Meikyuu for the Nintendo Family Computer. Labyrinth Maou no Meikyuu, translated to Labyrinth Maze of the Demon King, was released by Tokuma Shoten in 1987, the year after the film's debut. The project was developed by a small staff of newcomers, many of whom would go on to work for Atlus. The game was headed up by a pair of designers who had yet to make a name for themselves in the industry. Kazutoshi Ueda would go on to work on the Bonk and Shin Megami Tensei series, the latter of which Koji Okada would take a number of prominent roles in, directing such titles as Shin Megami Tensei 2 and Persona. In the game, the player takes control of Jennifer Connelly's character Sarah. In the opening sequence, she meets Jareth, the Goblin King, who informs her that she has 13 hours to rescue her baby brother Toby from the center of his treacherous labyrinth. In practice, the countdown clock in the upper right corner of the screen represents minutes and seconds, not hours and minutes, and will continually tick down as Sarah makes her way through the maze. The clock also represents Sarah's health and will have various amounts of time chipped away as she takes damage, based on the strength of the attacking enemy. But fear not, as there are a number of items that may be acquired to replenish the countdown timer, including a book that adds 5 hours, a clock that adds 3, and a tube of lipstick which adds 1. The clock and lipstick add time instantly upon pickup, however up to 8 books may be kept in the player's inventory to be used when desired. Starting out in an area outside the maze, the player must find the worm who will guide Sarah into the first actual play area to begin her quest. From there, the player must navigate through 12 unique areas on their way to the castle of the Goblin King, where Toby is being kept, only using a rock projectile to defend themselves. But simply reaching your baby brother will not be enough to complete your mission. In each of the 12 areas, a piece of the key to Toby's cell resides. Much like the 8 pieces of Triforce in The Legend of Zelda, the player must locate all 12 pieces plus a gem within Jareth's castle to reassemble the key before reaching Toby and completing the game. After collecting the key in the first area, Sarah will be transported to the center of a hedge maze where she meets the Wise Man. Here, the player can do a few things. Most importantly, the Wise Man will tell Sarah in which direction to exit the hedge maze in order to reach the next stage, effectively making this area a hub world of sorts. Sarah may also purchase extra time from the Wise Man using currency amassed from picking up treasure and jewelry. The only other use the Wise Man has is offering permanent upgrades, perhaps the most useful mechanic in the game, second only to acquiring the key pieces required to win. The player may trade 3 special coins collected from levels for either a magic wand or a beaded ring, the former of which halves the damage you take from enemies and the latter of which doubles your attack power. One of these special coins is present in each of the 12 main stages of the game, allowing the player to receive a maximum of 4 upgrades by the time they reach the castle. And yes, each of the upgrades may be purchased more than once and do stack. And since picking up the piece of key in an area will automatically transport you back to the Wise Man, it is recommended that the player attempt to locate the coin in each area first. However, if one happens to pick up the key before the coin, returning to that area and retrieving the coin will transport you to the center of the hedge maze. It's a nice little quality of life touch that I appreciate, and since 3 of the 4 hedge maze exits will always lead to previously visited areas, there are more than enough opportunities to go back and grab anything you might find useful. Speaking of useful items, let's talk about the other pickups in the game. Like the book item, up to 8 crystal balls may be stored and used at the player's leisure, instantly sending Sarah back to the Wise Man to purchase extra time, upgrades, or simply to enter a different area. And if you thought you'd have to go on this journey alone, Think again. Upon picking up a heart, the player must give it to one of 3 potential companions: Hoggle, Ludo, or Sir Didymus. Once 3 hearts are given, that companion will materialize to aid the player using slightly different behaviors from one another. Hoggle will stand near Sarah and fire a projectile whenever Sarah does. Sir Didymus similarly throws rocks with Sarah, but tends to rush out in front of the player character to get a head start on the action. Ludo is the only companion that does not attack, but his large size, hardy defense, and tendency to stick by Sarah's side make him an ideal shield against enemy attacks. After a while, the companion will disappear, but may be summoned again with a music box item, 8 of which may be stored in the player's inventory. Up to 8 hearts may be given to each partner, but any amount beyond the initial 3 required to recruit them has no effect. And if you're running low on items, the worm may be located in every stage, giving you the opportunity to buy the Labyrinth book, the crystal ball, or the music box. Of course, being an early console game coming out of the age of arcades, there are a number of bonus items that may be picked up for no use other than adding to the player's score. These include a footprint, an owl, a peach, a door knocker, and Lancelot, Sarah's teddy bear. If you're trying to reach a high score, these are the items to look for, but again, they have no practical use in the game. Labyrinth features 28 unique enemy types, only a few of which have palette-swapped stronger versions. Each enemy has its own behaviors and stats as well, representing a spectrum of hit points, speed, and attack damage, both melee and ranged. In later levels, Jareth himself will show up, quickly draining the player's countdown clock as long as he is visible on screen. Like other enemy types, he may be defeated with a number of projectile attacks from Sarah, or can be pushed off screen by moving away from him. Moving enemies off screen is a key strategy throughout the game. Many late game baddies are simply too powerful or resilient to dispatch effectively, although the vast majority can be technically dealt with a bit of old-fashioned violence. The hordes of enemies aside, the stages themselves provide plenty of challenge for the player. Not one level in the game is as simple as one of those maze worksheets we all did as a child, often employing a secondary underground area that must be utilized in order to reach crucial parts of the labyrinth above ground. Invisible portals in certain levels are designed so that the player is unaware they have been transported to another part of the stage, as the environmental elements surrounding the portal are identical at each entrance. Only when one has moved away from the unseen wormhole do they realize they're no longer where they thought they were, forcing them to backtrack and discover at what point they were whisked away. The Bewilderment Forest features trees that move about when off screen, forcing the player to roam in a single area, avoiding enemies until a path opens up. The Terror Maze is perhaps the most traditional labyrinth in the game, boasting only one floor and no portals, but instead a series of long corridors through which thrashing machines plow, forcing Sarah into alcoves and narrow passages to avoid their rampage. Labyrinth Maou no Meikyuu isn't just hard, it's downright punishing. The endless stream of enemies, defendable only with the player's projectile attack, remind me of Gauntlet, but without the saving grace of spawn points that can be destroyed. They just keep coming. The depleting clock is a constant reminder that you can't and shouldn't just take your time. There's a pervasive sense of anxiety to the game, somewhat assuaged by the resource management mechanics. That said, items in the game are finite, and if you've picked everything up and spent all available currency, you're simply out of luck when it comes to replenishing your time/health meter. In the later stages, and especially in the castle when enemies are the toughest, there is a delicate balancing act in deciding whether or not to press forward with what time you have left, or teleport your way back to the Wise Man for some extra time, or to enter a previous level to gather more resources you may have left behind. And if the time limit and the enemies weren't enough of a challenge on their own, the stages themselves are positively mind-bending in their layout and the spatial tricks they employ. So is it too hard? Maybe. But during my playthrough, I was constantly surprised at the complexity and creativity of the design on display. And I was even more impressed with how faithful this game was to its source material. If you're very familiar with the film, you've probably already noticed a number of mechanics and design elements that call back to Henson's movie. Sure, the entire game is a series of mazes, but that's just the beginning. Many of the stages are designed after scenes in the film, including the Goblin Gate, the Hedge Garden, the Bog of Eternal Stench, the Ballroom, the Terror Maze, the Forest of Laughter, the Junkyard, the Goblin City, and of course, Jareth's Castle. Allies and enemies who populate the game world are also lifted directly from the movie. Of course, there's Ludo, Sir Didymus, Hoggle, the Wise Man, and the Worm, but fairies, fireys, and a variety of goblins are also present and accounted for, as well as the cleaners who operate the thrashing machines. And we can't forget the Junk Lady! Most of Tsukasa Masuko's wonderful music programming is a direct chiptune recreation of both Bowie's tracks and Trevor Jones's marvelous film score. But I think it's the little things that resonated with me the most, like the fact that the lipstick and the Labyrinth book are used to add time back to the clock, as both were used in the film to help Sarah find her way. Even the 13-hour time limit and the way Jareth causes the clock to count down faster when on screen is a direct reference to the movie. And with all that said, this is by no means an exhaustive list of pains the designers took to make sure this Famicom exclusive embodied the very spirit of Henson's film. If you're a fan of Labyrinth and/or classic action-adventure games, I heartily recommend Labyrinth, Maou no Meikyuu for the Nintendo Family Computer. At least a little bit of Japanese reading comprehension is recommended for playing the game in its original language, but an English fan translation can be easily found online. Gameplay-wise, it sits somewhere between The Legend of Zelda and Gauntlet for me, employing item collection and resource management systems similar to the former, and the fast-paced maze running of the latter. And for the time, you couldn't ask for a more faithful movie tie-in game, if you're up for the challenge.